When I was learning how to shoot in manual, I saw hundreds of videos on YouTube that fell under two categories. Either one, they knew what they were talking about, but they were so slow and so boring. Or two, they were somewhat entertaining, but they were all over the place. That's why now that I have more experience, I want to make this tutorial on how to shoot in manual. I'm going to explain ISO, aperture, and shutter speed in a way that everyone can understand. Here we go. Alright, so the first term we're going to talk about is ISO. It's probably the easiest and most basic to learn. Basically, the way I think about it is it's fake light that the camera is putting into the image, right? So the higher the number, the brighter the image is going to get, and the lower the number, the darker the image is going to get. But keep in mind, this is fake light. So if you boost the ISO as high as it goes, it's going to be super grainy. But if you're at a low ISO, you're going to have a better quality picture. Check out the difference. Now, some more expensive cameras will let you boost the ISO a lot before it starts to lose quality. For example, I'm shooting on the Canon 5D Mark III, so if I boost the ISO to, 3200, 4000, it's not going to show as much grain as a lower tier camera would. And also, lower tier cameras don't even go that high in ISO. I think my camera goes to about 12,000, and some lower tier cameras might not go as high. Where you can notice most of the grain will be in the darker spots of your image. Like for example, this computer screen in the background, it's very dark, so if I crank the ISO, you would start to see it grain on the computer screen and some of these lower, darker areas. So ideally, you would have your ISO set at 100, but that's usually only realistic if you're outdoors and it's a bright day. So just keep that in mind when setting your ISO. Now, shutter speed is a little bit more difficult because it affects two things. Not only does it affect brightness, but also motion blur. You know when you're taking a picture, that sound that your camera makes? Well, that's the sound of the shutter opening and closing. Now, it's also a little bit difficult because shutter speed is different for photography and videography. Let's talk about photography first. First of all, when you take a picture, your shutter only opens one time. The amount of time that your shutter opens for is called the shutter speed. And like I said before, it affects brightness and motion blur. So check it out. On your camera, your shutter speed will be noted by a number. If that number is 60, that means your shutter is opening for 1/60th of a second before it closes. If your number is 30, that means your shutter is opening 1/30th of a second before it closes. Likewise, if your shutter is 1000, that means your shutter is opening for 1/1000th of a second. That means it's very fast. Now this is where it affects brightness. Let's say your shutter speed is at 1/20th. So let's just exaggerate and say this is how long your shutter is open for 1/20th of a second. When your shutter is open, it's letting light onto the sensor and it's capturing the image, right? As soon as it closes is when it stops. So if you go 1/20th of a second, you're letting light, boom, and your image is done. But if your shutter is 1/1000th of a second, it's going to open for a very short time and let not much light in. That's why your image gets darker at higher shutter speeds. Now that we looked at how the shutter speed affects brightness, let's look at how it affects motion blur. So keep in mind the same logic. If your shutter is open for 1/20th of a second, it's going to capture an image for a long time. That's why if your subject is moving while it opens, it'll create more motion blur. But if you're at 1/1000th of a second, boom, it's going to be open for a very brief time and it's not going to capture much motion. Even if you're capturing sports or something fast paced and it's at that high of a shutter speed, it's going to capture 1/1000th of a second, which is going to capture motion very well. Usually when I'm shooting handheld, I like to keep my shutter speed around 1/125th of a second. So on my camera it says 125. I find that if I go any lower than that, the picture is not as sharp as it could be because of my natural shaking of my arms. But at a higher shutter speed, natural shaking is not apparent and it makes for a sharper, crisper image. Now, for videography, it's a little bit different. A lot of people get confused between frames per second and shutter speed. Frames per second is something completely different that we're not going to talk about in this video, but we are talking about shutter speed. So again, in video, shutter speed is the amount that your shutter is open. But instead of photography where it's only open for one time, video it's constantly open, right? But thankfully in videography, there's a rule to make it a lot simpler. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, which most people do shoot at 30 or 24 frames per second, you want to make sure your shutter speed is double your frames per second. So if you're shooting at 30, your shutter speed would be at 60. And if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, your shutter speed would be at 120. The reason for that is because that's what looks most natural to what the human eye sees. Now, your shutter speed doesn't always have to be double your frames per second. For example, if you want to capture more motion, you might want to lower that shutter speed a little bit. And vice versa, if you want to have a very choppy, very motion blurless video, you would want to up that shutter speed. But the good rule of thumb that everyone follows is your shutter speed should be double your FPS, for the most part. The last thing we're going to look at is aperture, which is my personal favorite. Now, aperture, like shutter speed, affects two things. One, the brightness of your image, and two, the blurriness or field of view of your image. For this video, we'll just say blurriness because it's a lot easier to understand. Now, you know how I said your shutter is the amount of time that light has to get inside your camera? Well, your aperture is the size of the hole that light can get through. So check it out. If your aperture is this small, not a lot of light is going to be able to get through to your sensor. And if your aperture is this big, a lot of light is going to get through. Now, the thing that trips people up the most about aperture is how it's measured. I'm going to show you a chart so it's a little bit easier to understand. Now, the smaller your aperture is, the bigger the f-stop is, which is the number that the aperture is measured by. Now, a lot of camera and lenses go up to f22, which is a very, very small opening for light to get through. Now, honestly, I don't think I've ever shot with an aperture that small, but if it's a really bright day and you absolutely need to go down to f22, that option is definitely available for you. What I like to shoot at most is almost wide open, which on my lens is 2.8, f2.8. At f2.8, a lot of light gets through, but this is where blurriness comes into the picture. Without getting into a lot of the reasoning behind it, just know that if the aperture is wide open, your picture is going to be more blurry and have a shallower depth of field. So that's when your shots get kind of cinematic, where the subject of the picture is in focus and the background is blurry. So if you want to get some nice rack focuses, you can definitely make sure your aperture is wide open, which is remember, a smaller number, and then you'll be able to get those super crispy, super nice looking shots in your footage. So boom, there you have it. Those 3 things are all you need to know before you can shoot in manual. So just to recap, ISO is fake light. The higher your ISO, the brighter your image, but the more grain and the less quality. The lower your ISO, the higher quality, but the less light. Shutter speed, the amount of time your shutter is open for. A low shutter speed, 1/20th of a second, lets a lot of light in, but also a lot of motion blur in. 1/1000th of a shutter speed, fast shutter, no motion blur because it's so fast, and little light gets into the sensor. I've been doing this a lot. For video, you want to make sure your shutter speed is double your frames per second. And for photography, you know, if you're handheld, you want to be above 125, but it really depends on what you're trying to do with your image. Last up, aperture. A big aperture lets a lot of light in, and it can make your image more blurry and have a shallower depth of field. And it's measured by, remember, small numbers, 2.8. Now, a small aperture lets a little bit of light in, and you will not have a shallow depth of field. You'll be able to see everything in focus in the image. And also, even though it's small, it's measured by bigger numbers, so f22. Now, as far as understanding when to use each one, that just takes practice. Go out every day, go out in different settings, go indoors, go outdoors, go in shaded areas, go in bright sunny days, and eventually you'll really get to understand and learn when to use what setting. Anyways, I hope this video was easy to understand and it was short enough to keep your attention the entire time. Keep shooting, get better, and until next time.